got a little rasp in my throat today, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. But I should be able to make it through. Should be able to either run out of my voice in 5 minutes, or who knows? We'll see what happens. God is good, isn't He? I was listening to those words, and I wonder how many times you guys have done this. You go into the morning, you go into the day, you are facing it, and you're saying to yourself, I want more love. I want to have more love. I want to show more love. I just want that. I want more power in my life. I want all of these things. And then what happens? The very first thing that happens is some kind of a trial comes up, and we're going to talk about that. Those trials will come up, and they tend to bite you, don't they? They tend to nip at your heels, and sometimes they just work their way right on up until there's nothing left, and you just wonder, how did I start out this way? I started out wondering if I could have more power, more love, more of Jesus in my life. And then what do? I end up getting eaten up and bitten up by the devil. And we're going to talk about that today. And I can't think of a more aptly named message than walking on water in difficult seas. And yet the picture shows an entirely different story there. And I think you're going to find by the time that we're done today that you can have that same kind of picture in your life. We covered this when we started off in Matthew chapter 14. And Matthew 14 is so pregnant with possibility. There's so much that's going on inside of there. If you're to read, there's 3 of the Gospels cover this story. John in some detail, Mark in some detail, and of course we're spending our time in Matthew's rendition. But it all starts and it all seems to center around one thing. John the Baptist just got his head lopped off. That's Jesus' cousin. Jesus said about John the Baptist, he said, there has been none greater than this man. So he's a pretty important guy. And yet, there's something that happened in Mark that you don't see in Matthew. And there's something that happens right before John the Baptist event happens. What you need to know so many times is that events in the life of Christians, they're always aligned with God doing one thing, the devil trying to do another thing, reaction from the supernatural towards each other. So Jesus sends the disciples out one by one. You get the idea if this is the same as the other one that we read in Matthew. It's 70 go out and 70 come back. But this time he sends his disciples out and he gives them a couple things that nobody had ever had before. He gave them power over the demons, and they could tell the demons what to do. Nice, that'd be a good one. Here's another one that he gave him. He gave him power to heal the sick. That had never been done before, because now not only is it Jesus that can do this, but it's the disciples as well. That's pretty cool, and that's a major event for the world. But Satan, or you might say the other side of the spirit world, reacts, and they react this way. John the Baptist gets arrested. John the Baptist gets his head lopped off. And instead of Jesus going in the wilderness and saying, I got to work through this, God. No matter how I look at it, Lord, it is my, I set a beautiful glass of water on top of my desk, and then I forgot to bring it with me, but I'll bet you'll find one for me, Stan. But this is what happened. Instead of hiding in the backwoods of the backcountry somewhere where nobody could find him, what he does is he goes out and he says, all right, that's what you want to do, devil? Watch what I'm going to do. And in this next moment, what he does is he feeds 5,000. So we're going to talk about that whole sequence. And what I want you to know is that they're all intimately related to each other. And I think that where we get distracted so oftentimes in our life is that we forget that the author of the book of our life writes the pages of our life in sequence. He never writes them in confusion with each other. Thank you so much. Oh, it's cold too. Oh my goodness, that is so good. Was that as good for you as it was for me? Great. Oh, it's all on film too. But did it strike you that when this happens, when Jesus, when you see this reaction back and forth of the spirit world with each other, we a lot of times seem to be caught in the middle. there's three things that I want to focus in on here, three distinctive things that we're going to center in on today. And the first is the fact that Jesus gave authority over to the disciples. The second thing is, and that's a big thing, right? That's a big thing. Second thing is that you got Jesus taking Orca the killer whale and making a fish sandwich the size to feed 5,000 or more people. That's a big thing. And then you have this last thing, which we will center in on today, and that's this place where we see Peter walking on water, Jesus walking on water to him, and Peter in response walking back. What I want to just suggest to you today is that all three of those are intimately tied with each other. And I think that where we get distracted is that we don't think that God has been sequencing our life correctly. We think, how did this thing happen to me? It never should have happened. It does happen, but God always does things for a reason. We mistake the reason. We'll blame it on God. We'll do like Flip Wilson used to do and say, blame it on the devil. The devil made me do it. Whatever. But the fact of it is, there is some reason for everything that happens in our life that God has control over. But to make it clear, you need to understand what God's intent is and what God's purposes are. And sometimes that's not easy. But did it strike you in this story as we read it a couple of weeks ago, and we'll go through verse by verse today, is that when God does something, that He will often test you to see what you learned. For example, everyone here, we have a couple of teachers in our church here, and they could verify this, but the fact is you would get pop quizzes in school, wouldn't you? To see if you learned what it was that your teacher taught you. What they want to find out is if you're applying what they gave you. So it happens the same way with God. So one moment they are gifted with abilities that only the Son of God ever had. That's pretty cool. And the next moment they're wading in a sea of God's provision with the provision of the loaves and the fishes, and then they're drowning in the sea of their own fears. All there in just a few hours' time. But church, have you ever recognized that God will often put you through a test to find out what you learned in your class? And God will often put you through a trial to see if the information He gave you took. Are you getting what I'm saying? Did you learn something? So here's one of the things that we saw 2 weeks ago. We saw this. This is what a trial is. And we wrote it down. We put it on the board. It's on one of our slides coming up. And this is exactly what a trial is. A trial is an adverse set of circumstances that God will allow or God will bring into your life of His children in order to deepen their faith and their commitment to Him. Now, in some worlds, in some parts of Christianity, they say God's just trying to teach you a lesson, as if it's God's painful reminder that He always wants to teach you a lesson. If you don't need to learn a lesson, He's not going to teach you one. But God will often allow these things to happen to mold you, make you, and bring you into a place where you'll never have to go through that again. And that's what a trial can be. So let's see if we can get a synopsis of where we are. Jesus has just accomplished a marvelous miracle. He took 2 barley loaves and a couple of fish. He said a prayer over them, and all of a sudden he winds up with Orca the killer whale on the beach here, and he's got a sandwich out of that, and he feeds over 5,000 men, the Bible says, not counting women and children, so that could be anywhere from 15 to 25,000 people that he just fed there. That's a pretty major thing. Matter of fact, when the book of John lists about this, John's gospel says that when the people heard about this, they determined in their hearts that they were going to make him king. And why shouldn't they be? Because anybody who can do that, anybody who can make an Orca the killer whale sandwich out of practically nothing, ought not just to be in charge, they ought to be large. And so let's do what we can with them. And yet Jesus was not willing to become a welfare king based on what I give you, based on whether I feed you. And He was not willing to be able to just serve the agenda of men. Because Jesus, on His own merits, is King of Kings, right? Jesus on His own is the Lord of Lords, and He doesn't need men to tell Him who He is. And we pointed out that something happened after this event, right after these events, that Jesus went up into the mountain. And we pointed out that he didn't go up there because he was shy. He didn't go up there because he just was tired and wanted to get away from people. I can't imagine how tired Jesus would be. But he went up there for a reason. Now let's get back to our premise of our whole message series here. And that is that Jesus controls the existence of every trial, right? But he does it for a reason, and that's what we want to look at today. So we'll go back to Matthew chapter 14, and I want to read this, and as we go along, then we'll talk about it. But Matthew chapter 14, we'll start at verse 22. It says, immediately, and I want you to see how fast is immediate anyway? Usually immediately, right? So immediately, right after these events, it says that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of them to the other side. We pointed out 2 weeks ago, if Jesus did that, he had a purpose, and if Jesus did that, they're going to make it. Right there is all they needed to remember, is that Jesus told them to go to the other side, and that he would meet them on the other side, because it's ahead of him. That means he's going to meet them while he dismissed the crowd. Okay, so in verse 23, it says that after he dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. So there in the boat, going to the other side, Jesus sent him there. And verse 24 says that, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, and we considered that to be about 4 miles. It's 8 miles across, so maybe about up to 4 miles across. And then this happened. It was buffeted, and you could just imagine the waves throwing it left and right, and it was buffeted. The boat was buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And I love what the King James Version says. It says that the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with the waves, for the wind was contrary. I'll bet it was contrary. The wind was in a bad mood, you might want to say. The wind was unforgiving. It was contrary, all right. And they were rowing this way, but the storm pulled them that way. And in fact, in Mark's gospel, it tells you that the oars that they were using were of no use, because every time they tried to go this direction, the wind was in opposition to them. And when they tried to go the other direction, the wind was in opposition again. So this was a horrendous, life-threatening storm that they didn't think they were going to survive. And these are fishermen. They've seen it all. Oh, to know Jesus. Oh, to get this far in my life, to just die right here. They must have been thinking that, but it was a horrendous storm. And these boys were in one of the most negative situations that they'd ever been in. But this is what I want you to see in verse 22. Verse 22, it said that Jesus made them get in the boat. He made them get there in the first place. And if you forget that, then you miss the whole lesson of this whole message. You miss the lesson of this whole chapter. He made them get there. He had a purpose for that. And so, in fact, let's segue for a second and look at ourselves in that. Because as believers, we say every single day that God has my back. I believe in Jesus. Yes, I do. I believe in Jesus. How about you? And we go through that whole discussion. We know that God is there. We love God. Boy, we sure appreciate Him loving us. But then we consider the rest of the day. We don't consider the rest of the day we spend just fretting about everything. How am I going to pay my bills? What am I going to do about my job? What am I going to do about my kids, my parents, my this, my that? What school am I going to go to? Am I going to get through school? Boy, I don't know. And we fret about so many things. We're kind of like when Jesus said to Mary and Martha, the two sisters, one is in the kitchen, the other is at the feet of Jesus. And he tells the one sister, he says, you fret and worry about so many things when you should be sitting at the feet of Jesus learning from Him. And so that's what's going on here. But if you look in your bulletins, you got your bulletins on the way in. We stopped last week at right about this point. So you didn't get the second point, and that was this. And that is, Jesus is right there in the middle of the storm with you. And if I'm in the middle of the storm, guess what? I'm going to be okay. Or let me put it another way. If I'm with the Lord of the storm, who created the storm in the first place, I'm doubly okay. I'm going to be all right. Are you getting this? Because we cannot forget who owns the storm. Whatever storm you're going through, Jesus owns the storm, right? And he's right in the middle of it with you. So look at this in verse 25. It says this, Jesus walked out to the disciples. He went with them out walking on the lake. Jesus is probably just out for a little walk, huh? Jesus is probably out just having a little stroll on the water. There were 25-foot waves or whatever they were. I mean, this isn't just some little walk out in the storm. Jesus is out there in the middle of a freak of nature storm here, and you have wind billows. You have maybe 18, 20-foot waves, whatever they are. You have gusts of winds that no normal boat could survive under, and yet here's Jesus on a walk on the water. And I got to thinking about that this morning. Was Jesus kind of going in between the waves, or were the waves just parting as he would come through? And you know, it'd be tough for I guess the Coast Guard to be able to GPS themselves to a boat, but Jesus walked straight towards them, going right where he needs to go. And so the disciples, in the middle of all this ocean craziness there, Jesus shows up for them. But what does it tell you about Jesus? It does tell me this, that these boys in the middle of a storm that would make you, have you ever watched The Deadliest Catch? It happens on the Bering Sea in the middle of a really bad storm. It would make this storm would make that look like a Boy Scout camp. But they're halfway across the Sea of Galilee, 4 miles out of line of sight. So there's no way Jesus or the normal person could see them. And besides, Jesus went up to the mountain. He went up on top of a mountain to pray. And have you ever felt like you're in the middle of one of the worst storms of your life, and Jesus is up on some mountain or somewhere else, but he's not where you are? You ever felt like that? Well, that's what the disciples were feeling like. And so you're in the middle of the worst valley, and you say, I don't need Jesus up on top of some mountain. I need him right here. And yet I wonder if we've forgotten about this, that in Hebrews chapter 4, it says, he is moved about, we have a high priest that is moved by the feeling of our infirmities. He cares for you. What did you think he was doing? In fact, Peter, what did you think that he was doing up on top of the mountain? He was up there praying for you while you were in the storm, knowing as the Son of God what you were going to go into. Well, we'll explain that a little bit more because that can seem a little bit verbose, but you go through life, you're stepping through life, you feel like Jesus isn't there in the middle of it with you. You go through the worst valley and you're thinking, I don't need Jesus on some mountain. I need him here with me. But he wasn't there for just some kind of a good time. He was up there doing business with God on behalf of the lesson that you disciples needed to learn. Excuse me. But what we don't see is while he's on top of the mountain, knowing that he had to leave them out there in the middle of the ocean, there is something that God is doing inside of these disciples to mold them and to make them into the kind of men of God that they needed to be. And you'd have thought that maybe the disciples would have understood that with what they were going through. But what we need to understand is that we do have a high priest. We do have someone who is doing nothing less than praying for us all the time. And what a high priest does, a high priest will take your request before God, and he lets God, the Father, know what you're going through. He's fighting on behalf of you. He didn't forget about you. He never did forget about you. But what we're doing is we can be so transfixed by the middle of our storm. But here's the thing. We can honestly say, well, it seems like God has forgotten about me. And I don't blame him. I guess it does seem like that. But I wonder if you should consider your vantage point. You're in the middle of a storm. What did you think you were going to see? You're going to see a storm, silly. That's all you can see. But you should know that in the middle of whatever storm you're going through, Jesus Christ is there right beside you. So, and by the way, he didn't come when they wanted him to, did he? I'll bet they were crying for the last 12 hours because they had left 12 hours earlier. This was a long storm. And so Jesus wasn't there when they wanted him to be there, but he was sure there on time, wasn't he? I wonder how long they've been crying out to the Lord, Lord, won't you save us from this? But it does tell us that while it does tell us that when we look at this story, that even though in the beginning he was some miles away up on a mountain, he was still on the control of the storm that was in the middle of this ocean, or the middle of this sea. Because not only did he know what would happen to the disciples because he was omniscient, but he knew exactly what was going on inside of them. And having seen what was going on because of his prayer meeting with the Father, he decided to go on a walk. So what a walk that was. So let's see if we can get this. They're made to get in the boat. So they're made to get in the boat just after they just after they were a part of that miracle of feeding 5,000 people. And that was 3 to 6 in the afternoon. This right here is the next watch the next day. So that's about 12 hours later. So 12 hours these guys clearly had been struggling in the middle of this sea. 12 hours they'd been struggling, not knowing if they were going to live or they were going to die. But then there's Jesus on some mountain having a prayer meeting. Well, where is he in the middle of my struggle? At the right time, though, they see that he shows up. Jesus will always show up at the right time. So I want you to see something. Look in verse 26. It says that when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. And they said, it's a ghost, they said. And they cried out in fear. And we talked about a little bit about this last week, that the word saw there is that they stared intently at. They looked at with everything. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. And there's another Greek word there for ghost, and that's phantasma. Phantasma is where we get the word phantom from. In fact, what they didn't, phantasmos means a creature of your imagination. I guess it was their imagination. You remember that old Temptation song? It's just your imagination running away from you. You think they'll give me an offer over there at Motown? I don't think so either. But it was their imagination running away with them. And they thought as a result that this was a ghost. Now watch this. They thought it was a ghost. Let's see what happens. They got one part right. They're in a storm. But here's another issue. It's one thing to deal with a storm, but it's another thing when you got to start dealing with Casper the Friendly Ghost in the middle of a storm. And that's what they're doing, because it's got to be a ghost, because nobody walks on water, but nobody, meaning a ghost doesn't walk on water in a storm. So the number one problem is that that you have somebody walking on water. The second thing is they're walking on water in a storm. So that's number one, problem number one. They're in the storm. But problem number two, see, it's one thing when you see it, it's a whole other thing when you have 11 other people in your boat and they see the exact same ghost that you see. And that's a little bit weird, isn't it? But that's exactly what's going on here. So, but what they couldn't see is that problem number two was also their solution. Problem number two, what they thought was unexplainable was actually the explanation to their problem. And so you're thinking to yourself, if my inner storm goes any longer, if the things that I'm going through what in the world am I going to do? I mean, you think, and it's only getting worse. Every time I take a breath, it's getting worse. But what they didn't see as their worst may be their answer. The thing that they see that they're so fretting about, it's their answer right in front of them. And it could be that you're saying, well, I'm fighting the ghosts of my past. Well, that's fine, but that phantasma may be your answer. It may be Jesus showing up, but you can't see it because you're in the middle of a storm. So you say, well, I knew it was dark. I couldn't see, and the waves only made it worse. But hang in a little bit longer because your answer is on its way. It always has been. Look at this in verse 27. Verse 27, but immediately Jesus said to them, take courage. He says three things here. Watch this. Three things. He says, take courage. Then he says, it is I. And then he says, don't be afraid. So take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. And Lord, in church, you should know that there is no storm that you'll ever find yourself in that the Lord can't find you. Take courage. It's okay because he's right there. And if Jesus can walk on the water, then it goes without saying that the elements aren't going to stop Jesus from getting to you in the middle of that storm. So just take courage. It is him. He's going to be there. He's going to be with you through it. And and that storm sure can't stop him from getting to you, but it can't help your fear if you don't accept his help. So he says, fear not. And so what we need to see is, the same thing that was affecting the disciples was the same opportunity for Jesus to show God who he really was to the disciples. I mean, they're not even 24 hours removed from really the greatest event that had been in the Gospels up to this time, and the greatest miracle in the New Testament to this date. And Jesus wanted to show them that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That what he can do today, he can do tomorrow. They're going to be okay. And that's why the Apostle James says, you can count it all joy. Whatever you're going through, you can count it all joy because it doesn't matter, because Jesus is with you through it all. And James should know that. This is a different James. It was James the fisherman that was in that boat that day, but James, the brother of Jesus, would know that, wouldn't he? Because he'd seen it over and over and over again, that Jesus would always show up and do that which was needed for the moment. So you can count it all joy, not because you're in the storm, but you can count it all joy because in the middle of the storm, you can still walk through it. So listen to me now. Jesus honored their obedience because their first obedient thing that they did was it said Jesus made them get in the boat, so they got in the boat to go over to the other side. So, so Jesus honored their obedience, but the key to a storm, to any storm that you find yourself in, is remaining obedient. Be obedient. And so they were. And so he says to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. And I want you to notice something, that long before Jesus took care of the storm, he wanted to take care of something else. Jesus addressed their inner storm before he addressed the external storm. And God will always want to do that. Do you hear me with that? He says, peace be still. But before he said, peace be still, he wanted to still the spirit inside them, the problem that was going on inside of them. So to them first, he says, take courage, it is I. Calm your hearts because I've got this one. So saints, God will always want to fix what's going on inside of you before he takes care of what's going on outside. The things that are going around you, that's of no concern to God. Oh, he's concerned about it, but he's concerned about what's going on in your heart first before he takes care of what's going on in the world around you. So you have the issue of, I don't know what I'm going to do this month. I don't know what I'm going to do next month. You know, the job situation is up and down. Will I be able to keep this one? I don't know. Is God going to provide my needs? What's going to happen tomorrow? God's not the least bit concerned about your tomorrow. He is concerned about what's going on inside your heart. And I have found that in the years of ministry that we've been around, if you can take care of what's going on inside of here, you will find the issues and the storms that are around you, they will disappear and they will quell every single time. So he says, take courage, it is I. But I want you to look at that because God is fixing what's inside before he ever comes to fix what's on the outside. But what God is interested more than anything else is your commitment to him in the middle of that storm. So, as we go along here, Jesus doesn't just approach their external problem. He wants to fix their internal position. So let's go to verse 28. He says this, Peter, because in the middle of all of this, Peter is looking out, the disciples are looking out. It says that they see Jesus. He said, it is I, be calm, don't be afraid. And then after that, right after that, Peter says in verse 28, he says, Lord, if that is you, unless you're a ghost, if it is you, would you tell me to let me come to you on the water? I mean, Peter is the most amazing guy. In the middle of something like this, I could be losing my life. I might be looking at a ghost, but hey, if it's you, bid me to come and be with you, because that water walking stuff looks pretty good. I'd like to try that myself. Where does he get this in the middle of all that he's going through? But, we give him a hard time. But that boy really loved the Lord, didn't he? And he stuck around, and he was there at the end. And, okay, he denied Jesus 3 times, and he disappeared for a bit, but he was never very far. He stayed near the Lord. And, oh, that we would do that, if we would just stay near the Lord in the worst of our times. But in verse 28, it says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come near to you. Tell me to come to you on the water. And I would say that that's very, very powerful there. I'm not going to come to you unless as you call me. Listen, it's rough in the boat. It's got to be rougher out there. But if you will call me, I will come to you. I'm already scared inside of here, inside this boat. But if I just hear your voice, I'll come towards you. And I think there's something in this that I need to see. I don't know about you, but I just don't understand how you can be scared spitless one moment, and the next moment you want to get out of the boat and go talk to Jesus, go walk on water to be with him. And I mean, why would this half-crazed disciple do something like that? But I think it's... I apologize for all that. But I think that the answer was simpler than I thought, because I think that Peter realized that it would be safer to be with Jesus outside the boat than it would be to be with the disciples that were scared spitless of Jesus, or without Jesus in the boat. That the best place that he could possibly be. What do we got here? Some tea. Great. Wow. A steak sandwich next, garçon, please. Table 1. Take orders on the way out. They're getting hungry. But if we just saw this, Peter wanted to get close to Jesus, always had that idea. And if you're going through a trial, saints, what I need you to see is it's always better to get close to Jesus as you can possibly get. Get as close to him as you can. But I want you to see what happens. Jesus says, come. Peter gets outside the boat and he walks towards Jesus, and he goes that direction. And yet, here's the old Peter that I thought we forgot about. And yet, the same guy that has this tremendous faith to step out of the boat, all of a sudden remembers who he is. And I don't know what happened there, but verse 30 says that when that's Peter, verse 30, when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. Now watch this. This guy has the extraordinary faith to get out of the boat. That's pretty extraordinary, right? But here's the thing. There's a great deal of difference between extraordinary faith and sustaining faith. A lot of difference. That's why you that are younger, if you were to get with some of the older couples in this church, they would tell you stories about how the Lord has sustained them throughout the years, through the toughest of seasons in their life, and how the Lord has lifted them up when everything seemed to be going the wrong direction. That's sustaining faith. See, it's one thing to be able to take a step of faith. It's a whole other thing to know that the Lord's got you in the middle of it all, no matter how far you have to go. And so he had the faith to get started. But Peter did not have the faith to keep on going. And so he didn't have that sustaining faith to get from the boat to the arms of Jesus. He had the faith to get started, but not the faith to finish. If you hear gargling, it's because I take a drink and my mic is in the water. But watch this now, because I want to show you where people fail and where we have some of the biggest problems that we have. Because just because we have a little victory in the middle of the storm, are you going to forget that if you don't keep your eyes on Jesus, you're going to sink a little bit lower? Because in the middle of the boat, as bad as it was, he still had his feet on firm. It wasn't all that firm, but it was still firm something, and he was still on top of the storm. He was in the boat, he was still on top of the storm. He steps out in the storm, and if you take your eyes off Jesus and you sink, you are below the circumstances you were before. And so many times that happens in our lives when we have gotten out, we've stepped out on faith, we believe that God was going to help us through the the difficult storm of our life, and then we took our eyes off of Jesus. And what did we do? We sunk even lower than we were before. And it makes so much sense to me because Peter had a little bit of victory in the storm, but he forgot that if you take your eyes off of the Lord in the storm, you're even going to sink a little bit more. And so you think, okay, I get it. Well, I'll just go running back to Jesus, right? Well, see, that's the problem. You know, as soon as we get a little bit of relief, we wind up sinking in the water, and we go a little bit lower than we ever were. And all Jesus ever wanted for Peter to do, the one and only thing, keep your eyes on me. I am the author and the finisher of your faith. If you keep your eyes on me, it's going to be okay. And I can get you through this. And yet he didn't do that. So stop looking at your circumstances. Stop looking at the boat behind you. Start looking to the author and finisher of your faith. Look to your Savior. I mean, don't just think that, well, I had a good start. You know, so if I had a good start, I'm going to make it through with flying colors. It doesn't work that way. Peter was beginning to focus on the issues outside of the boat. That was the weather. Instead of focusing on the issues inside of the boat, which was his heart. Do you know that that's where the problem was all along? Peter needed heart surgery. The other disciples did too. And it would all come out later in their lives how much surgery they needed. But God was trying to do a work in here, not out there. The storm was never your problem. It never was. It's what God is trying to do right here. And if you can solve that part, the storms of life, they'll quell. They'll disappear. They won't be your issue of God in your life anymore. He'd have been fine if all he would have done was keep his eyes on Jesus instead of alone focusing on just the issue that was out there with the storm. So I want to close this story or this message down by telling you a story about an old friend of ours, Jackie's mine, one of our dearest friends. And if you're an animal lover, you'll understand this from that perspective, that one of your dearest friends can be that animal that stands right by your side. And we had one with Cassius. Any of you remember, did you ever meet Cassius? That boy, he was a bruiser. He was about a little bit smaller than Don. And Don looked, and you remind me of my bulldog. Really, Cassius was the most aptly named animal we ever had. And as Cassius was a marvelous dog, a lover of people at all times. He was about 75 pounds, though, so that's a big bulldog. Now, understand, he's not what you call a big dog. So, you know, you got these big German Shepherds or something else, Doberman. That's big. But he was the same weight as them, except he's only about this big. See, he's 15 inches off the ground, but about 15 inches wide and about 15 inches long. You might call him a English bulldog bowling ball. Yeah, that'd be a good thing. Because when he'd come down the stairs, if you were in his way, you're going down, baby. I'm telling you that. And that's just the way that Cassius was. Well, I will never forget the time that Jamie and Amato brought my grandson, their son, over to our house to show us how Gabe learned how to walk. And he was going to come in. You know how little babies do? We called it his Texas two-step, you know, so like all over the place. And Gabe is only 1 year old. Now, understand today, Gabe is a championship wrestler in his weight class for his age. He's not afraid of anything. It wasn't quite there at 1 year of age. And so he's down there walking back and forth, and I thought that we had Cash properly handled at the time, but maybe held back, but he got loose. He finally saw somebody that was close to his size and said, I want to be a part of that. So he runs over towards Gabe, and Gabriel sees them, and his eyes just brighten up like that, and he screams, and he jumps up into his daddy's arms, and so he's safe, right? And Amato probably did what he should do, just get down, dog, but he protected him from that. But here's the thing that was classic Gabe. Classic Gabe. Gabe looked down at Cassius. He looked up at his daddy, and he looked down at Cassius, and he said, he knew he had things in control because he was in the arms of his father. See, I think about that, saints, when I think about you, when I think about me. when we're going through what we are going through, and we're going to go through storms of life, you're in the arms of your Father. You don't have to worry about anything. I mean, what's going to happen to you in the arms of your Father? I mean, if you died, you're with Jesus anyway. I mean, that's what I aim for. But until then, I get to go through things of life so I can advertise Christ in me, which is the hope of glory. And I am the glorious example of that to everybody I meet. John and Tammy Junker gave their lives into the mission field in Japan so many years ago. You guys have been married 25 years now. And John's 26, and I'll let you, no, he's not. John's 24, so the math works. But they gave their life into the mission field so that they could go and do this very thing. Show a people in a foreign land who had never met Jesus Christ who this glorious God is. And to be able to live out the example of miraculous living to a people that would never have seen anything like that. You know, you do it here too. Did you know that your mission field is right next door to where you live? Or is it even closer? Maybe it's in your family. Your mission field is not in this church. Your mission field is outside the church. We need to put a sign right over that door that says you are now entering into your mission field, because it's outside those doors. It's not in here. And so the mission field that you are is you get the distinct privilege of showing off your God to a world that has never met him before. And what an opportunity that is. You know, when I probably have been proud of John Luke so many times this year, but I was never so proud as, you know, and this week I was suffering through, I picked up a bug somewhere, and I was laying in bed moaning and groaning, oh, Lord, will I ever get out of this big deadly sea? And my daughter knocks on the door and says, Rob, Dad, you're not going to believe this. 2 kids just gave their life over to Jesus Christ in John Luke's meeting. And I thought, man, you know, I don't feel bad at all. Now I have felt better than I'd ever felt all week because of that. And I'd never been so proud of him as I was. And you can be proud of the things that the Lord does, right? But that happened right at that moment. And one of them, I was kind of focusing on something else, so I don't know if you said this, if this is a repeat. But one of them was the next door neighbor who knocked at the door and said, looks like you guys are having fun. Can I come in and have fun with you guys? Ended up giving his life over to the Lord. And that's, see, that is, yeah, give the Lord a big hand on that. That is what it's all about. And if you can see that no matter what you're going through, Jesus Christ, the one who controls the waves, the one who is the originator of those waves, the one who knows where every one of those waves are you know, he's got this under control. But in 45 years of ministry, my experience is that people generally will stay in the waves until they begin to understand that they need to get that part of their life straight. The part that says, God, I'm going to keep my eyes on you.